Ever been gobsmacked by an odd word and thought, blimey, what does that even mean? Britain's got a long history of colourful slang, the sort that once rolled off the tongue in pubs and street corners, but has since slipped out of fashion. From cheeky old insults to quirky local turns of phrase, here are some long-forgotten bits of British lingo that deserve a second look. Unlike the playful oddities on this list, twocking is a bit of British slang with a much grittier edge. The word comes from police jargon in the late 20th century, specifically the acronym TWOC, taking without owner's consent. What began as a formal legal term for car theft quickly slipped into street slang, becoming to go twocking or a twocker. Back in the 1980s and 90s, when joyriding was splashed across British headlines, the word was everywhere. Youths caught stealing cars for reckless drives through estates were branded as twockers, and the term gained enough cultural traction to make its way into tabloids, police reports, and even TV dramas. It carried a gritty, urban edge that set it apart from older, quirkier slang. Over time, though, the buzz around joyriding faded, and so did the everyday use of twocking. Legal language stayed, but in casual conversation, the word slipped out, leaving it as a relic of a particular time in late 20th century Britain. Stepping away from legal jargon, clobber takes us into the world of clothes. In Old British slang, particularly from the late 19th and 20th centuries, clobber meant one's outfit, personal belongings, or kit. You'd hear someone say, "Nice bit of clobber you've got on," referring to sharp attire, or "pack up your clobber," meaning to gather your things. The word has roots in working class and military slang, often tied to uniforms or everyday gear. Over time, it spread into wider British culture, showing up in music press and fashion circles. By the 1960s and 70s, mods and skinheads were talking about their clobber just as proudly as soldiers once had. Though clobber can still occasionally crop up in the UK today, it's far less common than it once was. Younger generations lean towards outfit or gear, and the word has slipped into the nostalgic, slightly old-fashioned category of slang. Still, it's a brilliant snapshot of how everyday life, what we wear and carry, shapes the language we use. Turning to Scotland, scunner is one of those words packed with character. In Scots slang, to take a scunner means to feel a deep dislike, disgust, or aversion towards something or someone. It could be as mild as "I've got a scunner for that food," or as strong as describing a person you can't stand. The term has been around since at least the 14th century, showing up in Scots poetry and later in everyday dialect across the lowlands. What makes scunner special is its versatility. It can be both a noun, "he's an absolute scunner," and a verb, "that film gave me a scunner." It carries a sharp, visceral punch that ordinary English words like disgust or aversion can't quite match. While still alive and well in Scottish speech, scunner never really embedded itself into mainstream British English. Outside Scotland, it's often seen as quaint or archaic, and many younger speakers don't use it at all. That keeps it hovering on the edge, part living dialect, part fading relic of older UK slang. Dipping back into Shakespearean times, coxcomb was once a sharp way to call someone a vain, showy fool. The word comes from the jester's cap, which was decorated with a crest resembling a rooster's comb. Over time, it shifted from literally meaning a fool's hat to describing the fool himself, and later, any man obsessed with his looks and status. In the 16th to 17th century England, calling someone a coxcomb was cutting. It painted them as a shallow dandy, more concerned with ribbons and lace than wit or sense. Writers like Shakespeare and Ben Jonson used it freely, and the insult lingered in English for centuries as a fashionable jab at pretentious men. By the Victorian period, though, the word had already started to sound archaic, and today it's rarely heard outside of literature classes or historical dramas. Modern slang replaced it with quicker, punchier insults like poser or prat, leaving Coxcomb as a colourful but antiquated relic of Britain's past wordplay. Shifting into the murkier side of old slang, doxy was once a common word in 16th and 17th century England, especially in thieves' cant. It referred to a prostitute, mistress, or the female companion of a rogue. You'll find it sprinkled through ballads, plays, and criminal pamphlets of the Tudor and Stuart eras, where highwaymen and vagabonds often travelled with a doxy at their side. Interestingly, the word didn't always carry the same sting. In some early uses, a doxy could simply mean a sweetheart or lover, though over time the meaning hardened into one of ill repute. By the 18th century, it had firmly taken on the sense of a woman of low morals, and writers used it as both insult and description. Today, the term is marked as archaic in dictionaries and has almost entirely disappeared from everyday speech. Modern slang and euphemisms replaced it long ago, leaving doxy as a historical curiosity, one of many colourful fragments from Britain's old underworld vocabulary. Now here's a fun one, Gallimaufry. This wonderfully clunky word goes all the way back to the 16th century and literally meant a kind of hodgepodge stew. The name itself comes from French Gallimaufry, a dish made by throwing whatever odds and ends of meat you had into one pot. Pretty quickly, the meaning stretched beyond food. By Shakespeare's time, Gallimaufry was being used figuratively to mean a jumble, mishmash, or medley of things. Playwrights loved it because the word sounded as messy as it described, an unorganised mixture of ideas, people, or styles. Although you won't hear it often today, it hasn't vanished completely. Some writers and critics still reach for it when they want a colourful way to describe a chaotic collection, whether it's a cluttered essay, a playlist, or even a gallery exhibit. It's one of those words that shows just how much English loves borrowing and bending food terms into metaphors. Let's dig into Mumpsimus, a cracking bit of old slang that's almost too good to have disappeared. The word comes from a story in the 16th century about a priest who, instead of saying Sumpsimus, Latin for we have taken, stubbornly kept saying Mumpsimus during Mass. Even when corrected, he refused to change. From there, the term caught on as a label for someone who clings to a wrong idea or habit, even when shown the right way. It was popular in Tudor times, with writers like Erasmus and even Henry VIII using it to mock people who were pig-headed and unwilling to admit mistakes. If someone was called a Mumpsimus, you knew they were being roasted for their ignorance and sheer stubbornness. These days, the word's fallen out of everyday speech, but it still pops up in historical writing or when someone wants to sound especially sharp in calling out outdated thinking. It's a reminder that English has always had witty ways of poking fun at human folly. Tucked away in the annals of old British markets is the word Biffin. Biffin was a type of flat-dried apple, particularly the Norfolk Biffin, which was squashed and baked into a chewy, leathery treat. It was a staple of old markets and festive tables, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries. But language loves to wander, and Biffin soon picked up some slangy twists. In Victorian street talk, it could be used to describe someone with a clubfoot or a physical deformity, not unlike how people casually and cruelly coined nicknames back then. There are also records of a biffin being used as a cheeky insult, meaning someone a bit useless or unlucky. Over time, the food sense largely disappeared as the dried apple treat went out of fashion, and the slang fell away too. Today, you'll almost never hear it, unless you stumble on a dusty old recipe book or a bit of Dickens-era banter. Now this jaunty little word comes straight out of the 18th century and was used to poke fun at people who strutted about like they were 10 feet tall even when they weren't. Think of someone full of bluster and self-importance, but without much to back it up. That's your classic Cockalorum. The word itself likely comes from a playful mash of cock, as in a rooster, strutting proudly, and a lurum or lorum, nonsense syllables added for effect. It's the kind of sing-song, mocking word you can almost imagine being shouted across a playground or slipped into witty banter at the tavern. In essence, if someone was being called a Cockalorum, they were being laughed at for acting far grander than they really were. Though it's mostly vanished today, you'll still find it lurking in older dictionaries and even children's word collections, proof that English has never lacked colourful ways of taking pompous folks down a peg. Ever had one of those moments where your brain just can't keep up? That's exactly what Bumfuzzle was made for. This quirky bit of slang, dating back to at least the 19th century, simply meant to confuse, perplex, or fluster someone. It's the kind of word that sounds as jumbled as the feeling it describes, which probably helped it stick in people's heads at the time. Writers in America and Britain both dabbled with it, often in light-hearted or comic settings. Picture someone hopelessly tangled in an argument, or a character getting lost in a muddle. That's when Bumfuzzled would fit perfectly. Sadly, it never cemented itself in modern English, fading away in favour of plainer terms like confused. Still, its bouncy sound gives it charm, and every now and then you'll see it pop up in retro word lists or crossword clues. It's a reminder that old slang could be just as playful as it was practical. Imagine walking into a room expecting peace and quiet, only to be hit with shouting voices, clattering dishes, and bodies squeezed shoulder to shoulder. The Scots had the perfect word for that kind of bedlam: Clamjamfry. Originally rooted in Scots dialect, Clamjamfry wasn't just about numbers but about sheer disarray. If someone complained about a clamjamfry in the street, you'd know it wasn't simply a crowd, but a chaotic one. Too many people, too much noise, and no order to be found. The term eventually broadened into describing any kind of clutter or confusion, whether it was a busy marketplace, a rowdy house, or even a badly written book. Although it's faded from modern use, clamjamfry lingers in old Scottish literature and word collections. It's a perfect example of how regional slang could capture the rhythm and humour of daily life, painting vivid pictures with just a single, unforgettable word. Let's talk about one of the more playful relics of British slang, which is Scobberlotcher. The word itself dates back to the 18th century and was used to describe someone who was, quite simply, a lazy good-for-nothing. If you wanted to mock someone for dodging work or loafing about, calling them a Scobberlotcher would do the trick. It has that perfect mix of silliness and sting, sounding almost like a joke, but carrying a sharp edge when said aloud. The exact origins are a little murky, but it likely evolved out of dialect words tied to idling and loafing. It wasn't the sort of insult you'd expect in formal speech. Rather, it belonged in the chatter of working folk who had no patience for shirkers. Someone leaning on a shovel, instead of digging or hiding at the back when the hard graft began, would be branded a Scobberlotcher. Over time, the word faded from common use, eclipsed by simpler insults like idler or slacker. But in its heyday, it carried a real bite, a way to call someone out for being deadweight in a world that prized hard work. Today, it survives mainly in old dictionaries and word collecting circles, a quirky fossil of the language that once thrived on colourful put-downs. Back in the 1600s and 1700s, if you wanted to describe someone chattering endlessly about nothing of importance, Twattle was the perfect choice. It comes from the same family of words as twaddle, both carrying that sense of empty, silly talk. You can almost hear the dismissive tone in the sound of it, light, quick, and a little bit mocking. It wasn't just about harmless gossip, though. To twattle meant to babble on pointlessly, wasting words and, by extension, other people's time. A person branded as full of twattle was likely the sort who cluttered up conversations with trivialities, the type you'd avoid at the tavern if you valued your evening's peace. Over time, twattle slipped out of common use, while its cousin, twaddle, survived and is still recognised today. But in its prime, the word was sharp and effective, perfect for calling out nonsense without sounding too crude. These days, you'll only find it in older dictionaries or literary references, but it's a neat reminder of how English has always had colourful ways to tell someone they're talking rubbish. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, this word was thrown around to describe someone who was, frankly, a complete fool or a person of little value. It combined fop, meaning a vain, showy man obsessed with fashion, with doodle, a term for a simpleton. Put the two together and you've got a wonderfully silly-sounding put-down that rolled off the tongue with just the right amount of mockery. A Fopdoodle wasn't just foolish. They were the sort of person you wouldn't take seriously in any context, someone seen as weak, inconsequential, and laughable. It wasn't meant as a mild jab either. In its heyday, calling someone a Fopdoodle was closer to outright ridicule, a way to cut them down in front of others. Like many colourful insults of the time, it eventually fell out of use, replaced by newer slang that carried the same sting. But even now, the word has a kind of charm to it, and you can imagine it being used in a restoration comedy or shouted in a lively tavern brawl. It's a perfect example of how older English insults managed to be both biting and ridiculously fun to say. We've all been there, tucking into a meal while someone hovers nearby, giving you that look. The Scots had a perfect word for it: groak. The word pops up in Scottish and Northern English dialects from centuries past, and you can picture the scene perfectly. A hungry child eyeing a neighbour's pie, or even a dog staring longingly at its master's plate. It wasn't aggressive begging, it was that quiet, lingering stare meant to guilt the other person into offering a bite. While the practice certainly hasn't vanished, the word sadly has. By the 19th century, groak had already begun slipping out of common speech, leaving only faint traces in dialect dictionaries. Today it survives as one of those delightful lost words that internet lists love to resurrect. Short, sharp, and oddly relatable, groak proves that some human habits are eternal, even if the words we use for them aren't. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if you remembered some of these slangs, or if you learned something new, and don't forget to subscribe for more information and nostalgia. See you next time.